Hello, this is Mahan. Today I'm going to be talking about using params to send multiple API requests using both Jetman and Postman. Now I'm going to navigate to Jetman Labs first. I'm going to go to the new button. I've created a sample environment, but now I'm going to create a new environment. Let me name it testing environment, in short for testing. For some reason, when I'm trying to create a new variable, it's not going to allow me to. So let me just send an normal API request. So this URL you see here is a sample API testing service. The code has already been written, and this is the URL most commonly used to test REST APIs. And here you can see the types of requests that are available. The most common request, like the four most common requests are get, post, delete, and put. So this time I'm going to read. So I'm going to go to their website. As you can see, it says a hosted REST API ready to respond to your AJAX requests. So let me add a request body. So this returns a sample page of JSON response that corresponds to the user number 2. But what if I wanted to send multiple requests at the same time with the same base URL? Then I'm going to try to create multiple variables that append to this base URL and then send requests all at the same time and get multiple responses. So I'm going to try and do that. So for this I need to go to their documentation and see how that works out. It says reusable variables, create environment and dynamic variables globally or use them at any suites or inputs. Extract response and store in variables. So I'm going to click on getting started. But looks like the testing tool only supports a single request to be sent to an API, as you can see here. Now I have to figure out how to add multiple arguments to the request. So environment variables, runtime variables. But I think these are all for saying how to create a local environment that helps you run your API and test your API like you have in Postman. You can see here, you can click on new and you can create an environment and you can name it whatever you want. So let me name it the same, but let me add a Postman thing to differentiate it from the Jetman environment. I'm going to add a new variable named read request and another request called a post request. I'm going to create a user. So that should be API slash API slash users slash 2. This is going to be slash API slash users. So I can say, so let me rename this in API terms. It's called a get request instead of a read request. Yes, that is good. And let me name this post request. I'm going to add this. says manage environments. So I can just go to this. So let me select my new environment, which is test environment in Postman. As you can see, I can set the headers to this. So the most simple thing is called as cache control in terms of headers. So what cache control does is that it caches the request sent to your API and uses the cache response to send the request to send the response back to the user. This reduces the amount of time it takes to return a response. As you can see, you have a cache response value of a cache control value of 800, and I named it cache control variable. So I'm going to add another request, but looks like we don't need anything more. Cache control is the most commonly used. So I'm going to send the request to the same API as I did in Jetman. So it's going to send the request. Yes, you can see the response in Postman, and it's a JSON response. You could also see the amount of time it took for the API to return a response back, and the amount of time it took to download the response. And this would be the response size that you can see, and this would be the response status code. It also says that it's the standard response for successful HTTP request. But what is the unsuccessful response? That would be a 404 response. So what I'm going to do is click on don't save. There's another feature called as params. Params are used whenever you want to concatenate multiple credentials to an API request. Like say you have an API token, or you have something like a verification process. That's when you try to use params. But for such an API like this, like request response.in, you do not need to use params. So therefore, I'm going to set the header to 800 and send the response. And now I'm going to look at the time. It took me 952 milliseconds for the API to return a response. Now I'm going to increase the value to 12,000 and see what happens, which means 12,000 milliseconds. As you can see, the response time reduced to almost 69 milliseconds. That's how much difference caching makes in an API request. I can demonstrate the same thing here, as I can set the header to cache control. As you can see, it automatically appears, which is a very nice feature compared to Postman. So I'm going to add the header value as 800 first and then 12,000. It took 6 milliseconds for the API to return this response. For the second response, it takes almost 2 milliseconds. One thing I noticed about Jetman that was different from Postman is that Postman takes time to prettify this response and return it in this format. But Jetman directly returns the API response in such a short time, allowing for faster testing. But if you want to take a look at the statistics of the machine that the API is running in, then you can see here it says date when the API request was sent. As you can see, today's date is October 17th, and this matches this date. And you can see it's a JSON response. And you can see the backend server. The same way you can also see the response here. And for that I need to send a request again. and look at the headers. And you can see it shows me that it was sent on 17th October, and it shows all the request statistics and the status code for this API request. This is pretty cool as Jetman offers the same service at a cheaper price compared to Postman, which costs almost $25 compared to $15 for Postman. So now I'm going to navigate the collection runner. So what collection runner is, it is a feature similar to Postman's new project feature where you can create a new project and an environment and run the API on your local machine and start testing the API. This is very useful for situations in which you do not want to host your API but want to test it beforehand before deploying it to the web. And you could also have a console where you could actually see the logs of the API that you're testing. The same feature is also being implemented in Jetman, where you can create a new project and you can browse your directory. Say I want to click on my new project. I can see that this is a sample API testing project. So that is good. I'm going to click on create. It's going to create a new project. So let me try a local host URL. So this is one of the URLs of my API, as you can see here. This was my file. And you can see that there's something called a new project that got created. There are multiple DB files that store the types of requests in. One of the most common things I would look at is the history. I can see all the requests that I've sent in this DB file. Second thing I can see is that should be the environment that I'm testing the API in. There are multiple other things that store details about our requests. So I'm going to delete this route and just keep the simple route, which is API/test. So let me go ahead and run my API. You can just do python 3 app.py, and it's going to start the Flask server at 127.0.0.1, which is nothing but localhost. So I'm sending an API request to that URL, which is the API/test route, as you can see here. Clearly matches. So I'm going to send a request and I get a response. As you can see, that is the benefit of creating a new project. If you don't create a new project, you cannot send requests to localhost API, localhost URLs. But both Jetman and Postman provide the ability to send requests to URLs that are running on the local machine and does not need to be hosted globally. This allows you to test your API before deploying it, which is a key part of the development process. So other than that, thank you for watching this video and hope you have a very good